Estamos ao vivo no canal da TV UFMS e eu já faço o convite para quem não se inscreveu no canal, se inscrever e ficar por dentro de todas as notícias da nossa universidade. E eu já faço reportagens diárias, boletins de notícias, transmissões, e a nossa equipe está preparando uma programação especial, então fique por dentro, fica o convite para vocês. Agora, eu convido a todos a participar do workshop Smart City. Bom workshop a todos.
A Laura falou, a gente está iniciando o workshop. Eu vou só ler a biografia do Bill e da Grace, tá? Rapidamente. Vou falar um pouco. A biografia deles está em inglês, vou falar um pouquinho em inglês. Tá? So Bill and Grace, first of all, I'd like to thank you for this research briefing and say that we are very excited about these events. And now I'm going to read your biography. Well, Bill Finnerty is a VP analyst in Gartner Research, where Mr. Finnerty is a member of the public sector team over smart cities, communities, and public safety justice, include the topics of digital government, technology platforms, digital twins in government, geospatial technology, industry vendors, and strategy. Mr. Finnerty previously served as a Chief of Information Officer for the Pennsylvania Department of State, where he was responsible for the Department of IT Strategic Direction, budgets, policy, and staffing strategies. While at the Department of State, he established an agile project management methodology implemented in NATO practice, oversaw system modernization projects, and worked on projects to deliver online service to the public. He was also the Director of Information Technology for Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, where he led the Information Technology, ERP, GIS, Electronic and Archive departments. During his tenure with the county, he implemented a social media program, oversaw the implementation of county-owned microwave network, and the creation of a county information security division. He also had key positions on a number of governance boards, including public safety, records committee, and executive leadership team. He has also been adjunct professor of Central Pennsylvania College, where he taught classes in system analysis and design, ethics, and application development. Grace Farrell is the other analyst. She's an associate principal analyst of and governance and education team. She supports higher education vendors and institutions, provide insight and research on student information systems, continuing education, and career service tools. Prior to join research and advisory, Grace spent 3 years serving Gartner clients in the mid-sized enterprise. She has experience in working with higher education vendors, with a particular focus on vendor roadmap and new client acquisition. Now I'd like to call our Vice Rector, Professor Camila, to talk about a little bit, and then our Rector, Professor Turini, should talk a little bit. Thank you.
Hi, I would like to thank you, Bill and Grace, to share with you your knowledge about smart cities and to share the idea of improve our university in campus intelligent and sustainable and a smart campus. Thank you. Welcome to our university.
Obrigado.
Hi, welcome, and congratulations, Grace, Katia, Bill. We are very happy to partner with Gartner. It's very important in science innovation, and this theme is strategic for UFMS and Mato Grosso, Brasil. Parabéns, muito obrigado e sucesso na nossa palestra.
Obrigada. Gonda, podemos começar?
Podemos, eu ia falar isso pro Bill.
Obrigada. Hi, Bill, Grace. You can start, please.
Obrigada. Olá, boa tarde. Prazer falar com você hoje. With that, I'll my very bad or mal Portuguese to English. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, and I know Grace does as well. Today, we wanted to talk to you about smart cities and building a roadmap to enable a smart city future. Will help both in the smart campus development that you're working on, as well as your engagement with local cities, communities, and the state to help drive their smart cities efforts forward. So let's get started. Alexander was an architect, professor emeritus at University of California, Berkeley. And he had this hypothesis, this position, that there were some essential ingredients missing from artificial cities, the cities that we attempt to build today. That our modern attempts to create cities artificially are, from a human point of view, entirely unsuccessful. He had this perspective that when we build cities today, when we architect them, we fashion them after a tree, right? With a trunk that then spreads out into various branches and onto leaves, but that didn't create this humanist view of a city. It didn't create the intersections that were necessary. And so I want to focus our presentation today, our discussion today, around that very integral piece of smart cities, the human, right? That human point of view. Smart cities projects can be about all sorts of things, technical things, like IoT sensors that detect air quality. They can be about data, such as developing analytics capabilities to predict crime or potholes. They can be about citizen resident quality of life, such as a bike share or smart parking. You're going to have a lot of questions that you need to answer, a lot of questions are going to help you define your vision and direction, the vision and direction that you help your partners get to. You're going to need to be a really good storyteller to show the value of smart initiatives that you choose, that your partners choose to invest in. So let's explore Alexander's lattice hypothesis a bit more. So his position was that this branch, this tree perspective on cities wasn't the way that cities grew organically, and that it ultimately didn't put the humans at the right spot. Instead, he believed that a lattice, this interlacing structure, was the way that cities should emerge. And of course, a lattice is a thing on which we grow many different things: vines, roses, grapes, and others. When we look at a city, one that has evolved over time, we can see that the lattice develops. that there are these intersections, these points of intersection that become the places where people gather and commune. People are easily able to traverse from one neighborhood to another, to interact with each other, to have those human experiences. When telling the story of a smart city, these points of intersections, these experiences, this human factor, that's what is going to make a city a better place to live, work, and play, which is our ultimate goal. So as we keep that in mind today, we're going to take a look at three key issues. The first of those is how you can scale governance to develop an intelligent urban ecosystem. If we're going to move beyond just IoT projects, we're going to have a direction to go. Second, we want to look at how can you model the ecosystem to guide its growth and sustainability. And third, we're going to look at how you can use trend spotting to achieve smart city priorities. So let's dive into that first topic, scaling governance. And when we talk to cities today, I can't think of a city that I've spoken to in the last 3 years or so that doesn't have smart activities going on. They're doing something with IoT or something with data. Might be that they're doing smart traffic management or smart parking. They might be using data to analyze congestion or air quality to be able to make improvements to the quality of life. But often these individual projects are still siloed. And there's nothing wrong with a siloed project. It will help gain efficiencies for your campus or for a government that you're working with. But the reality is that as a siloed project, those efficiencies, which are very important, will only take you so far. When we envision a holistic smart city, what we see is something that is greater than the sum of the parts. As we start to look around all the different types of activities that a smart city can execute on, when we start to share data, when we start to share technology and platforms, then we start to really see the growing value that a smart city can provide to those that live, work, and play there. So the key to get from these siloed projects into this more holistic view is going to be the governance that you put into place. Technology is incredibly important. Data is absolutely essential. But for any of us that have worked in the field for any length of time, we know that, to be honest with you, those are actually sort of easy things. It's the people part, the decision making, the small p and sometimes big P politics of it that really are the challenge. And so we know that's where we need to focus on. So when we start to look at smart cities that we've worked with over the past few years, we've developed a model around the execution path that those leading cities have taken. Cities like Paris and Gutenberg and Fort Myers and others of that nature. And as we start to look at those, we see there are 3 steps that they took early on, right? They developed this ecosystem and the governance around it. They established a community collaboration effort, and they put a platform in place. 3 keys that we've seen repeated over and over and over again. And when we get to the end of this section, Grace will share with you an example of just one such city in the south of Florida. Now, as we look at the ecosystem, right, this is not just technology companies, but of course, this is universities. This is different tiers and areas of government. This is the private sector. And of course, nonprofit organizations coming together. The collaboration piece is absolutely essential because we've seen time and time again where smart city efforts, at least those that are siloed, get executed, but if they aren't meeting the expectations, the needs of the community that they're serving, they aren't doing that, they aren't humanist in their approach, they don't get adopted. And finally, the platform has been absolutely key for these cities because as they onboard new technologies, as they experiment, as they bring vendors on, and of course we know this is a growing vendor market, the platform gives them an easy way to onboard them efficiently and offboard them when necessary. Now, once we got through these first 3 steps, leading cities have then sort of taken on 2 additional steps. Those being the development of a data exchange and a digital twin. Helsinki is a perfect example of this. So is Singapore. Singapore has actually developed a number of different digital twins and a number of different data exchanges around health data, around financial data, around air quality or pollution related data, environmental and sustainability data. As we look at the data exchanges, one of the things that's key around the data exchange is this is more than open data. This isn't just put the data out there and let's see what happens. This is a focused effort, engaging the ecosystem, understanding from them what is the valuable data that they need to be able to create something new. And that's the data that gets exchanged. It's not just government sharing that data. It could be other private sector organizations. Could be institutions. It could be other tiers of government. By gathering the correct data, giving opportunity for researchers and developers to be able to access that data and use it, they gain quite a bit of a significant amount of value. And then digital twins are being used by cities as the other element here to be able to model the future state of their cities. Today, they're using those digital twins to be able to understand situational awareness on a more holistic perspective. They're able to use it to do scenario planning, to understand how changes in the city will impact people and their lives and the way that they work. And ultimately down the road, we see them moving towards automation and using the twin to automate certain activities. Now, all of that has been going on through about 2021. In 2022, we see an additional piece coming into play here, and that is the human at the center. And the UN has been very key on this. Along with work with the ITU, they have brought out the concept, pulled forward the concept of a human-centered city, of a people-centered city. And so I think that over the next course of time, as cities continue to evolve these major technologies, they're going to do so more with the human at the center of what they're trying to do. So as we start to talk about them moving forward, we need to talk about the governance that they're going to use to move from those siloed projects into that more holistic view. Now, a few years ago, I read a really great book by Jim and Deborah Fallows called Our Towns. Our Towns is about some research that Jim and Deborah did flying around the US, trying to identify amongst communities that were rebounding from setbacks, financial setbacks, ecological setbacks, and other types, to understand what is it that caused them to be able to evolve, to be able to come back and be able to rebound. And to me, what was interesting is at the time, Bettina Tratz-Ryan, who helps me lead our smart cities research, were working on this idea of governance and what were some of the things that we saw that were common amongst the different tiers of government. Specifically, we were working with Balboa, Spain on this particular activity. And there's a significant amount of overlap between what Jim and Deborah found as they flew around the US and what Bettina and I were discovering through our research. So as we look at governance, we realize that cities, of course, are not a political entity, or at least not solely a political entity. There's much more to a city. There's, of course, education, there's healthcare, there's private sector and others that participate in that city. And so when we start to talk about creating this holistic view of a smart city, that we need to be in the position that we can include them in the governance if we want to be able to get everybody working the same direction, moving the same place to be able to achieve our mission and outcomes. Now, in doing that, we have to also identify that these independent organizations, right, these independent enterprises will have, in a number of cases, their own strategic directions they need to go. They will not always be in the position that they can share everything that they're working on. They would give up competitive advantage. And of course, private sector isn't going to do that. So what we've identified in our research is that there are 5 areas that they can work on together, along with government, and ultimately along with governments throughout the region, to be able to build trust between the different partners. Those 5 areas are accountability. So they can hold each other accountable by having a common set of metrics. Looking at the ITU and some of its metrics later on in the presentation, there's also the ISO and a number of other organizations for which they could build those off of. Common investments is the second area. Investments that are going to allow them to work together to be able to pool their resources, and whether those are financial or personnel or expertise, to be able to achieve their mission. The third area is risk. Risk is a complicated one when we start to look at this, because risk from a government perspective does not always mean the same thing as risk from a private sector perspective. And so there has to be a significant amount of effort put in to normalizing that conversation and being able to pull that together. The fourth area is data. Data is the value that we're creating here. Data is, as has been quoted a number of times, the new oil. And if that's the case, then we have to be working together on how we create the most value out of that. And then the fifth area is all around experience. How do we create a consistent experience? This is going to help us build the equity that we need to ensure that the human remains at the center of the initiatives that we are working on. So as we do this, and we use these 5 metrics, as we've seen done in Balboa, Spain, and other areas at this point, we build trust across the various tiers of partner, because we're putting transparency into that governance process, which is an absolute essential for us to be able to achieve the outcomes of a smart city at that intelligent urban ecosystem level, that integrated regional perspective. So with that, let's take a look at an example from one particular city, and I'm going to hand it over to Grace to go over this case study.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Camilla, one thing that I took from last call is that your team really wanted to focus on energy and water. So what I tried to do here is I tried to pull an example that Bill actually wrote. Bill wrote a fantastic case study on Coral Gables. Coral Gables is located right near Miami in Florida, and I actually live in Florida. And I know that flooding is a huge issue in Florida. It affects tourism, it affects travel. So while Coral Gables developed many different smart city initiatives, I really wanted to focus on what they did in terms of sustainability. So the city really became a leader in smart city initiatives because they were able to use environmental sensors that measured air quality, noise pollution, and most importantly, water. So the sensors in these waterways were able to measure the salinity, the pH levels, the presence of chemicals, but most importantly, these really critical issues like red tide. Red tide is algae that really affects the water life. And as we know, Florida is a state that many different people come to visit every year for family vacations. When red tide is present, a lot of people don't go to the beaches because it's unsafe to swim and even be near the water. And Bill, if you can just hit the next build, what I wanted to show here is that the city of Coral Gables in Florida worked with many different universities in the United States. You'll notice that they worked with the University of Miami. Of course, the University of Miami is in Coral Gables, so very local. But they also worked with what we like to call R1 research institutions, these massive universities in West Virginia, in Massachusetts, in California. And what we realize is when these smart cities collaborate with research institutions, whether that's domestically or globally, they have a tremendous outcome. So the one thing that I really wanted to focus on here was the presence of the waterways and the sensors in the waterways that really helped Coral Gables reduce a lot of the environmental impact in the area. Of course, Coral Gables focused on other initiatives. As Bill wrote, there was a reduction in crime and accidents by over 40% in 2 years using technologies like AI and machine learning. But what they are most proud of is that reduction in carbon emissions and energy consumption by 12%, and their goal is to reach 20%. So just one example of a smart city that's really focused on sustainability in the United States.
Thanks, Grace. I would just like to say thank you to Ramondo, who is the CIO in Coral Gables. He's been a friend for a number of years at this point, and he is absolutely dynamic, and the city is incredibly lucky to have him there. Just today, he opened up a additional smart corridor or smart section of the city. He has been building out in these smart areas Wi-Fi and smart street poles and the use of data to be able to achieve these very outcomes he has. And I was excited to see him do more that he announced just today. See if we can get my PowerPoint to move forward here. Apologies, everyone. Small technical issue. There we go. Now, hopefully it doesn't jump ahead 7 screens on me as it catches up here. So let's move on to the second topic, which is how can you model the ecosystem to guide its growth and sustainability? So we've talked about how we're going to use the ecosystem to take on this regional perspective, create this holistic view, intelligent urban ecosystem. And doing so is not something that will happen by mistake. We need to be purposeful in our development of an ecosystem. Now, my friend Fabio Giustini, who is an analyst at Gartner, developed Gartner's digital ecosystem framework a couple of years ago, in which, after studying a number of different ecosystems, came up with 5 keys, right? 4 areas that they are working on or that they need to be engaged with. And at the core of that has to be a set of organizing principles. And for each ecosystem, there needs to be a clearly defined set of participants. Now, that could be as open or as closed as necessary, but everybody needs to understand who can participate or can or needs to participate to make the ecosystem healthy. Second, there needs to be an established set of rules related to the ecosystem. How are people going, who's going to be, we're going to determine participation, engagement, exchange of information, insights, and value. Third, we have to look at the capabilities. What are going to be the shared capabilities of the ecosystem? Are we going to develop a common platform, a data exchange, a twin? What are the things that we're going to need to be able to move this ecosystem forward? And finally, there has to be a value exchange. We have to be able to define what is the value that each ecosystem partner is going to get out of the ecosystem. We can invite lots of organizations to the ecosystem. We can invite particularly the private sector to come in and participate. But if we can't define for them what the value is, they will not stick around for long. Now, as we adapt this digital ecosystem framework for smart cities, the key is that we need to look at the organizing principle, and we need to understand that the organizing principle is a humanist one. The people that live, work, and play in the community, city, or area that we are talking about. So the key is making quality of life of that resident that person that's working there, that organizing principle. So I want to walk through this model as it applies to a particular scenario. And we're going to use some work done from the UN. So Grace, why don't you set up the scenario here and I'll walk through the framework as it applies to that scenario.
Yes, absolutely. So many smart cities look to leverage these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as they work in their smart city planning. Unfortunately, lower income by and large are heavily affected by floods and natural disasters. We'll use Hurricane Katrina as an example. Hurricane Katrina was a Category 5 hurricane that hit New Orleans, Louisiana, very badly in 2005. 1 in 4 people in Louisiana at that time lived in poverty. So this is an example in the United States where it took years and years and years to rebuild back from Hurricane Katrina. Luckily, our technology is much better and it has developed since 2005. But the United Nations knows that globally, many poor communities are hit the hardest when these natural disasters, especially flooding, occurs globally.
All right, so we will take a look at this idea of using the framework to build out an ecosystem that relates to this UN Sustainability Goal 11.5. And so we'll start with the core of this being the principle of quality of life for the residents being there. We're going to we're going to stick with that idea. Then we'll start to take a look at the principles, or I'm sorry, the participants, as we look at the ecosystem. We could certainly identify any number of participants, and the list here is not intended to be all-inclusive, but instead to be representative of those that we may want to engage in this particular ecosystem. As we look at the ecosystem, we would need to consider government organizations being involved in this ecosystem, or government participants such as city planners, Public Works Department, Department of Transportation, and others. We may want to consider including some private sector organizations, such as insurance companies, right? Or companies that are high water consumption businesses and organizations. And finally, we're going to want to make sure that we've looked regionally at some activities, such as potentially emergency management and public safety, and of course the residents that are impacted. Now, as we look at these different participants from the ecosystem, we'll ultimately get down to where we start to identify value for each of these. But when you think of insurance companies within the context of dealing with storms, there's some very interesting work that I've been tracking that's going on in a couple of different places, Glasgow in the UK, and then also in the Hampton Roads area, which I know Grace will talk a bit more about later, in Virginia. Hampton Roads, Virginia being the Virginia Beach area. And in that, they are building models, and the insurance companies are starting to engage them to use those models to be more proactive, not just in how they're going to use their actuaries to rate the insurance needs for that organization, but actually get to the point of using it to communicate with residents. If you have a connected car, for instance, why couldn't an insurance company say to you, Bill, you just parked in a spot that we think is going to flood in the next 3 hours. Please move your car to a higher ground. Great value for me as the person that owns the car, great value for them as the insurance company, because of course they won't have to pay out on a claim. And it's great value to the community that is being served because there's less damage, less risks involved for them. We see also programs like the one in the WAIT program in New York City that was developed by Environmental Protection that uses an ecosystem approach and deals with high water consumption businesses. They implemented this program with the idea that they can or have businesses and other organizations limit their water consumption or their distribution of water into the sewer system during high-risk times. So they track with the National Weather Service weather patterns that are coming in. EPA has a number of IoT sensors, flow monitors in the sewer system. They are able to understand when the sewer system is at capacity or reaching capacity. And then they're able to communicate using a multi-channel communication tool to the organizations, and in some cases residents, to say if you can either not do something such as wash clothes right now, or you're to cauldron your water momentarily until the storm passes and the system can handle it, then they provide benefits on their water and sewer bills. So we see that, you know, these participants may not always seem like the most common ones. When we think of a storm, we think of the disasters. But if we start to think of how we might be proactive in the way we deal with services, we can expand the number of participants that we have. The second area is the rules. We're going to start to look at the rules of the ecosystem around that storm management and 11.5. We're going to want to look at how we start to do that governance across the region, across the different sectors. We're going to have to consider things like data privacy rules and data usage. How do we ensure that we're using that data ethically? How do we consider what is appropriate rules? How do we look at monetization of that data, and by whom, and when is that important? We need to consider the ethics of AI and how we're going to adopt that, and what is community acceptance. We have to look at equality and equity, and of course we have to consider how we're going to measure that the ecosystem is meeting our ultimate mission goals. And so we're going to want to consider engaging with a number of KPIs from one of the standards, or one of the global standards on metrics for smart cities. The third area is capabilities. And so when we start to look at capabilities, the shared capabilities across these ecosystems, we might start to look and have discussions around data exchange platform. You know, there are a number of platforms that Data for Good has helped develop to be able to address various UN Sustainability Development Goals, including this one. And so they are a potential partner to bring in to have or be involved in that conversation. We may look at geospatial resources and how we can share the location-based data to improve the way that we are able to respond and be able to reduce our risks. We might look at engagement tools, including collaboration tools, communication tools, and others that are going to be shared capabilities of the ecosystem. Who's going to own the intellectual property of those? Who's going to be a responsible party? Who and how are these going to be financed? And then we start to take a look at the fourth part of the ecosystem framework, and that is the value statement. We have to take a very holistic view of value. If we're going to include the entire system in creating value, we have to understand how is going to benefit each of them. So we need to look at value across the various participants in government, residents, private sector, all of those different organizations. How is the value going to be given to them? Is it in the form or is it in a monetary form? Is it around access to data? Is it improved services or reduced risk? These are all key areas that it's essential that you have a conversation with, and that the ecosystem is transparent about. When the ecosystem fails to be transparent, lose trust, and ultimately ecosystem partnerships start to devolve when that happens. So we know that this value exchange is absolutely essential. And then we can bring all the pieces together to be able to ensure that we're improving that organizing principle, the quality of life for the humans that live in that particular area. So Grace, why don't you take a look at that example I mentioned from Hampton Roads area of Virginia, or Virginia Beach area, and share that with everyone.
Yes, so this is another example of a university that really focused on water and flooding concerns in the Virginia area. The Storm Sense project really focused on low cost, low energy water level sensors to enhance the capabilities of communities to prepare and respond to those disastrous impacts of sea level rise and coastal flooding. What I do want to mention here is that they used machine learning to develop a water level model and utilized natural language processing through Alexa for community updates. This project happened, I believe, 2 or 3 years ago, and it has since become the pride and joy of William and Mary. And what I would encourage your university to do is that when everything has been completed, make sure that you're talking about it. Make sure that you're posting this on your websites, and make sure that you're making it known through marketing efforts, that you are trying to become this smart campus and eventually this smart city. So this project was funded through the federal government, and it was really impressive for the University of William and Mary, as well as the Virginia Institute of Marine Science.
Yeah, and Grace, you mentioned that this is, this project has been ongoing for a couple of years now, 2 or 3 years. And what's quite impressive there is that they do continuously innovate. The ecosystem continues to grow and be included. I mentioned the insurance companies earlier as an ecosystem partner here. That's more evolution. Earlier on, Missouri, AWS were both early ecosystem partners, along with the College of William and Mary and VIMS. And now we see that there are additional partners coming into play in this ecosystem. This is a great project looking across a broad area that is, as Grace said, can act as a model for other university-driven projects that are impacting the broader region, and how they can not only to evolve and be successful, but how they can be used to promote the value of what your ecosystem is generating. So let's take a look at the third section of this presentation, which is how you can use trend spotting to achieve smart cities priorities. As the university seeks to be a partner to local communities, cities, and the state to create smarter cities that are humanist, that focus on quality of life, it's important that they understand who the governments are that they are engaging with. For many cities, the idea of being smarter is easier said than done. We talked briefly about how you will help them with governance, but let's dive deeper into that conversation in this section by exploring how we can help cities understand what the art of the possible is, what technologies and practices will need to be used to achieve this goal. A big challenge that you will encounter in working with governments is their acceptance of risk. Local governments, according to our 2022 CIO survey, have clearly stated that their acceptance of risk is very low. And when asked, as it comes to new technology, what's your enterprise approach? Only a little less than 8% were able to say that accept risks and costs of new technology and deploy as early as possible. 8%. That's going to be a challenge as you start to look through this. So part of what you're going to need to be able to do is to help you start to look your university as well as the communities that you're working with to understand how they can more confidently accept risk, and adopt these new technologies to improve the quality of life for the people that work, play, and live in their cities. Now, we have a tool called the hype cycle. And I'm not going to try to go through the hype cycle in great detail here, but essentially, this is a way that we look at, as analysts, the adoption of new technologies and practices from a risk and maturity perspective. As we consider a technology that starts out and is an innovation, ultimately that innovation moves up to the top of the hype cycle, where it's getting a lot of publicity, gets a lot of recognition in the press. People are talking about it. Talk to more than one government CIO where this is the point that the mayor or a city council person goes to a conference and comes back and says, we need to do X, right? Whatever that may be. We need to be a smart city, or we need to have blockchain, or whatever the technology may be. But ultimately, there's a lot more promise on the technology than there is practical use generally at that point. So from there, the technology has to go through a process to prove out its value, and ultimately, on the right-hand side of the curve, reach its plateau of productivity, where it becomes mainstream, or where it doesn't, where it drops out. But as we look at this, when we talk about those risk-averse cities, most of them want to talk to you and to us technologies that sit on the right, or on the latter part of this curve, right? They're in that risk-averse section, things that already have been proven out. But if what we want to do is help the communities that you're working with, the cities, states, etc., to be able to win at the smart city game, they're going to have to consider those technologies earlier on in the hype cycle that are going to give them that competitive advantage. They're going to have to shift to that earlier engagement in technology and practice out in the position to be proactive rather than reactive. Now, doing that, you can use a process called trend spotting. With trend spotting, we use a funnel perspective guided by innovation management and strategy to be able to explore what are all the emerging technologies and practices that we could consider for the community or the city. We need to filter through those how do they align with the specific challenges that we face? Are there new opportunities that they present for the community to be able to grow? What are the technology dynamics as this technology matures? The maturity, the costs, the associated risks, ethical use. Is it humanist? Okay. We have to look at what the operational impact would be. What are the potential benefits, the change impact, etc. And through those filters, we ultimately get to the point that governance can make a decision to say, yes, this is a technology that we want, or a practice that we want to move forward with. And from there, CIOs and IT organizations can move their organization forward by putting those onto their roadmap and starting to understand how they're going to fund these, how they're going to resource these projects, and they're going to move forward. Easy to say, but how? It's much more difficult, as I said, to do this than it is just to talk about it. So let's take a look at another example. In this case, I'm going to use a fictitious city called Emerald City. And with Emerald City, they have a community goal of creating a future of sustainable energy. So they've established this goal as a city. They have worked on this goal with their ecosystem partners, to include some regional government organizations, to include private sector partners, both from the technology side and manufacturing side. And they're working with the residents to understand how this not only improves the quality of life, but how they can contribute to the betterment of the city and achieving this goal. Now, as we look at this particular initiative that the city has set out, we want to consider how would that hype cycle for smart cities work. Now, each year, Bettina and I collaborate with a number of our peers to create a hype cycle for smart cities. In this particular example, this is the one from this past year. The new one will be published in about a month for 2022. But as we look at the technologies, there's a number of technologies, if we have a very risk-averse organization, that we can say are on the latter part of this curve, and that we might want to start to consider talking to them about things around sustainability and COP21 or 23. Looking at intelligent street poles, a technology that has advanced significantly over the past couple of years to become a much more modular, composable set of technologies that allow you to pick and choose the pieces you need as a community to be able to derive value. Technologies like outdoor location intelligence to help understand where people are in relationship to challenges that the community faces. Like Singapore are using this exact approach to be able to tell people who are asthmatic if they're walking into areas that have high particles in the air that they need to be concerned about. And building information modeling systems to help us understand what is the carbon footprint of a particular building. Now, if we look, though, at making that shift, right, and trying to go earlier in the hype cycle, earlier in the adoption of technologies, we want to start to talk to these communities about exploring technologies and approaches such as edge AI, right? Those smart or intelligent street poles work better when they can process locally, right? When computer vision or other IoT sensors, data can be processed and not transported across the network unless necessary because it's an actual triggered event. We then, we may want to talk to them about data exchange and establishing a real data exchange around the idea of energy consumption and pollution. Or we may want to talk to them about developing a digital twin to be able to create a holistic view of the efforts across the entire ecosystem, getting data from, or model data from GIS, being able to incorporate data from various types of sensors. Maybe those are sensors from a manufacturing plant on their exhaust. It may be street sensors. It may be traffic sensors to look at the amount of vehicles moving in the area. Creating a twin that allows leaders to make better real-time decisions to be able to help their community. Now, if we look at these, we want to talk to them deeper about this conversation around early technologies and how they're going to aid them, to be prepared to have that story. We want to be able to connect that story back to humans, back to that quality of life issue, that piece that's in the center of our ecosystem model. Okay? And so if we were to look across you might consider having the conversation around edge AI and how improving the power grid could improve the quality of life of individuals in the evening. Individuals that come home and when they're have adequate power to run their stove, their other appliances, or for their children to be able to have the computer or devices to be able to connect to school because they're able to get the power for those to be able to do their homework or their additional work. We might talk to them about a data exchange from perspective, how the data from the program or the data related to air quality or energy consumption could be gamified to be able to help individuals to learn how they can advance or how they can do better at helping to achieve those missions. Korea is working on just this right now. They're actually using a metaverse-based application as part of their K-verse implementation to gamify some traffic-related items for producing better pedestrians. That has to be their goal. It's not around energy. It's definitely an interesting use of metaverse and gamification from a set of data and a data exchange. We might talk to them about digital twins. How we modeling renewable energy solutions for the power grid could allow us to get to the point of being able to have residents be able to pay energy back into or submit energy back into the grid to make the grid more sustainable and to be able to profit on energy that they haven't consumed. All of these stories about the technology, but more importantly about the people and how they're able to improve their lives based on the city, the community, the state becoming a smarter place to live, work, and play. And so with that, Grace, could you take us through one more example here?
Yes, thanks, Bill. What I wanted to focus on is the University of Melbourne in Australia. And Bill, if you can hit the next build for me, I would like for university to see that the University of Melbourne was built in 1853. So it's a pretty old university where a lot of their original campus buildings are still erect to this day. Now, we know that buildings that were made almost 170 years ago are not the most energy efficient buildings today. So if you look on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll notice that the University of Melbourne was able to raise $45 million, which is how much this smart campus initiative will cost. That is a ton of money, no doubt about it. But the project is financially sustainable with a projected savings of $6 million per year from reduced energy usage. And you'll notice that this university in Australia focused on multiple energy saving technologies, including LED lighting, building and optimizing thermal performance, energy analytics, HVAC or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning efficiency. They are beginning to build solar panels on campus. And as we know, these initiatives do not happen overnight. This university has been planning for these smart campus energy upgrades for quite some time, and they are continuing to do so in the future as well. So we've seen quite a few smart campus energy upgrades that are happening globally. A lot of universities in England, many universities in Australia and the United States are working on these smart campus goals to really enable a better future for not only the students, but the faculty and the surrounding city where the university is located.
Thanks, Grace. I even recently spoke to, you mentioned a number of places. I recently spoke to a university outside of Toronto that is working on a similar project and engaging with the local ecosystem, the energy grid provider, as part of that overall project to understand not only what's the impact on the grid as they build out some new buildings and they refurbish some existing ones, but also on how they may be able to contribute back into the grid in a productive manner that is ecologically friendly. So I think it's another great example from around the world on how smart activities are helping make places better to live, work, and play. So, Grace, I didn't mean to cut you off. No? Okay. Sorry, I thought I heard you start to say something. All right. So with that, what are the recommendations? We've talked about developing the ecosystem and the governance. We've talked about how you've got to model that ecosystem and drive value through it. We've talked about how you can help the communities you're working with and the university to use trend spotting to take that bigger view down into a practical roadmap. So from there, you start out by leveraging adaptive governance to guide the development of your intelligent urban ecosystem. No one governance process is going to work for every need, and it's not going to work consistently over time. Taking an adaptive approach to governance allows you to continuously evaluate the situation you're in, get the feedback, listen to it, and adapt your governance as you need to. As you add additional partners, as you change goals and objectives because you've achieved some and you're moving on to the next, you're going to want to continue to evaluate that governance process and make sure that you are adapting to your needs. Second, build trust amongst your ecosystem partners. You're going to do this by promoting transparency between the various organizations at all levels. When there isn't trust between the partners, and ecosystems start to dissolve. It isn't as though it's the only answer to making them successful, but we know that it certainly make them fail if it's lacked. Third, define the participants, rules, capabilities, and value that your ecosystem is going to bring to your smart cities activities. Make sure you're taking the time out that ecosystem and how it's going to work and how it's going to deliver value. In the end, you're going to also want to consider looking at nearby ecosystems and how your ecosystem will engage with those. What are the things that they've learned, the opportunities that they have, the risks they've taken or realized, and how that could impact your organization or your ecosystem. The health of that ecosystem is essential. Once we've started a set of projects, we have to realize that some partners will come and go, and modeling the ecosystem is a way to ensure that we're always staying out of front of those risks and helping to create a healthy and vibrant way for our communities to engage. Fourth, drive the value of data to create predictive and proactive services. Move to the left in that hype cycle or in that wave, and start to understand that creating the value, how that's going to create value for the constituents that you have. And finally, implement trend spotting with your teams, ecosystem partners. Use this to establish and keep investment plans aligned with the priorities, but also ones that you can accept from both a opportunity and a risk perspective. As your organization, as your city, as your community starts to move forward in this, it helps to build the momentum and be ready to sustain that momentum and driving your university and your cities that you're working with into being an intelligent urban ecosystem, that much smarter place for everybody to live, work, and play. So thank you very much for your time. I wanted to break here, and Katya, I believe we're going to go to questions and answers. Is that correct?
Yes, Bill. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Grace. Luciano, you work with the Q&A session, okay?
Pessoal, agora é a fase das perguntas, né? Se alguém tiver alguma pergunta.
Pode ser em português, Gonda? Can I speak in Portuguese, please?
Yes.
Yes.
Pode ser, a gente traduz aqui.
Obrigada, thank you. Uma pergunta que eu tenho para o Bill e para a Grace é porque, assim, no Brasil, diferente aí dos Estados Unidos, a gente a gente não tinha uma cultura e que a gente tem aprendido aí muito com mudança de matriz energética, pensando na história do país. Então, a gente tem uma matriz energética baseada em hidrelétricas, a gente não tinha a dificuldade na questão de energia, mas acho que algumas mudanças têm acontecido e nós temos aí a ocorrência de alguns desastres naturais agora e pensando na pandemia da Covid, que mudou todo o parâmetro de todo mundo e também das instituições e do nosso país. E aí, quando a gente vê todo esse monitoramento, a parte de conexão, né? A gente viu da questão de sistemas multimodais de comunicação. Quando a gente viaja para os Estados Unidos, a gente tem uma defesa civil que nós mesmos, visitantes, recebemos as informações sobre inundação, sobre velocidade de ventos, algo que no Brasil tem iniciado. Eu gostaria de ouvir um pouquinho, pensando, quando a gente fala ainda em comunidades, que eu entendi que a gente vai trabalhando os ecossistemas e depois a gente vai fazendo essa aproximação, mas a centralidade está no humano, né? No ser humano que está no ambiente, ele se apropriar da cidade inteligente e entender aquilo como um real benefício no dia a dia. O que seria trabalhar com a comunidade, com o ser humano, para que a gente possa ter essa apropriação, né? A importância que o humano entenda como um grande valor, agregar valor à sua vida, um investimento, porque a gente percebe também que investimento é grande, para que a qualidade de vida, quando fala work, live and play in smart cities, para que ele entenda isso como algo que vai valorar a sua vida e sua experiência de vida como um todo.
And Paul or Katya,
Yeah.
are you able to assist
Oh,
with the translation on that?
Yes, I can do this. Camila said that in Brazil we are facing a change in our energetic metrics, and there are some disasters that are happening now, and the COVID has changed a lot of things. And in Brazil, we don't have the same structure as the US. When we visited US, we received some messages from the government saying about the climate, some alerts from the visitors. But in Brazil, it's not the same. And when we are thinking about the ecosystem, Camila wants to understand how can we work better with the human, for the people really understand that can get value from the efforts from the initiatives of the smart cities, and how can they really get the engagement that these opportunities or these projects and initiatives, they really bring a new experience, a value experience of life for them. I try to do the best, Camila.
Thank you,
No worries.
thank you, Katya.
Yeah, no worries, Katya. I think we can definitely pull out a couple of good things here. I want to bring out two examples of engagement that I think are actually, I'm going to bring out three examples of engagement that I think are really worth going to take a look at. The first one of those will be Portland, Oregon, as it relates to micromobility, particularly scooters and bike shares. And I'll come back and explain each of these in a bit more detail. The second one will be Dublin, Ireland, as it relates to air quality and the ecosystem there. And number three will be Christchurch, which also happens to be around micromobility in that particular area. So when we look at these different communities, some of the common things that they've done is before they engage the ecosystem and the vendors, they engage the community. They start to do a couple of things. They map out who are the influencers in a particular area or on a particular topic. So, for instance, in Portland, they engaged a local bicycle group. They engaged a local commuters service group. They engaged with the local accessibility community, those that have accessibility needs, to start to understand what was the challenges that they faced related to micromobility. They used that information as a starting point, not as a whole, but as a starting point. They then engaged the vendors and identified, here's the key challenges that's faced by the community, and had the vendors address how they would tackle those particular problems. They then, every 6 months or so, they surveyed the community, and they grew that survey as they understood different groups that were impacted to be able to continuously get their feedback. The engagement and the survey did not take place just online. It also took place in person. There was a number of cases where they went to the street and they would speak to individuals and record surveys. They went to community groups and discussed the projects with them, etc. So I think that's one of the valuable lessons. Engage early, engage often, and make sure that you're continuing to expand who you're engaging with. In Dublin, the interesting piece was around air quality. They have a number of air quality sensors spread across the region, but they are fairly far between, and they don't give the average resident a particular value on an hour-by-hour basis. Yes, they can understand when they're having an air quality problem for the day, but not as it shifts throughout the region. They've engaged with a company out of Northern Europe that creates personal air quality sensors, and they have have worked with that company to integrate that sensor data into the mapping and communication solution that Dublin and actually ultimately Ireland's Environmental Protection Agency put into place. The engagement there was slightly different because although they engaged early, similar to the way that Portland had, they also had this company come in and do some of the engagement. Because the individuals would buy the sensors from the company and then agree to providing the data to the government. They would also, the sensor itself would give the individual the information they needed on a regular basis, the value for them on the immediate. But in that, there had to be a conversation across the government and the provider so that the community had trust in the provider, that they were a ecosystem partner of good standing. In Christchurch, that being the third example there, they also had a challenge around micromobility. They actually had a failure, though, that ran them a challenge that created an engagement problem for them that they were brilliant at overcoming. The challenge was they had contracted with a provider to provide micromobility solutions. And in that, company ultimately went out of business shortly after the contract started. And of course, that left a number of people that had made changes to the way they were commuting and the plans they had suddenly without service. And they responded quite quickly. They engaged other potential partners, organizations that came in second and third in the contract. They had them help reach out to the community. They also, like Portland, engage a number of advocates throughout the community, some community leaders that they reached out to immediately and had help solve the problem and help communicate it. So that sort of gets three different views on that engagement piece that I think are some pretty good examples of different ways that communities have been successful in that engagement effort.
Tudo bem, Camila? Com essa resposta?
Sim, thank you, thank you.
Mais perguntas, pessoal? Podem fazer em português, não tem problema.
Katya, I see one in the chat. I've got to figure out how to get to the chat to read the whole thing at the moment.
Bill,
There.
Bill, I can read it. Caroline
Okay,
says,
Grace, thank you for
yeah, of
helping
course.
with my technical difficulties.
Caroline said, Bill and Grace, thanks for the speech. How can we measure the benefits to society related to sustainable actions provided by the university?
I, to be honest with you, would go back to the EU and the UN and the model that they've put together. The ITU's U4SCC metrics align with those sustainability goals. And I will share some slides that I've developed related to that with Katya to share with you with the university. Those metrics really are looking at in many cases, the quality of life impact of investments that are made. And it becomes a great way to not only be able to say, look, we didn't just create this. This is an international standard. Therefore, there's quite a bit of research and substance around it. But it also becomes a way, if you look at the ITU's webpage related to this, it becomes a great way to be able to do comparisons between cities. It's not quite the same as the ISO's 37120 series of metrics and the World Congress on City Data, although many of the metrics, to be honest with you, would overlap quite easily. It's not quite that World Congress on City Data, but they've published so many great case studies, the ITU has, that you can easily go in and be able to say, okay, here's a community that's done this really well. Here's where their metrics are at. Here's where their goal is. Here's where we're at. We want to be able to catch up, or we want to be able to exceed them, or look, some of the leaders, right? And I think that the information around those, the models in place are quite valuable in being able to use that to tell the story to the community. Now, in telling the story, I think that tools, that first of all, a multifaceted set of tools are important. Everybody being on the same page of what the story is and how you've accomplished it. Sharing through dashboards, things like user maps, which is a storytelling activity using maps when it's spatially located or spatially related. Be ensuring that there is a outreach to reach non-digital communities and what the benefits are can be important parts of that. But I think those two pieces can provide a solid foundation.
Thank you, Bill. Caroline, tudo bem com a resposta? O Bill vai mandar um material complementar e eu circulo aí para vocês, tá?
Alguma pergunta, pessoal?
Hi, Bill. Hi, Grace. Thank you for all the information that you share with us. We have a constant transformation in connectivity technologies, and now we have a big one happening, that is the 5G technology. How this new technology will impact the smart cities projects?
Well, 5G alone, from a networking perspective, is going to really do two huge things for smart cities activities. Number one, the personal bandwidth that will be available for communicating to individuals will make solutions like augmented reality through glasses or wearables, not necessarily through the phone, a much more viable way of enhancing the communities that we live in. And so that bandwidth and the ability to communicate faster, better, more impactful will definitely be a huge benefit of 5G. The second piece is that because of the capacity of 5G, we also see that there are a lot more sensors that will be able to be deployed over smaller areas using the same network, using for defined networking. There's a number of providers globally, Deutsche Telekom, for instance, Verizon, TELUS in Canada, that are moving towards smart cities as a service models enabled by their 5G implementations. Of course, 5G is costing the telecommunications companies significant sums of money. Just charging everyone a few dollars more a month on their bill isn't going to recover the costs. And so for investors, they need to have a more aggressive model. And part of what they're doing is they're moving to this smart cities as a service model where they will deploy the infrastructure. They will even deploy IoT sensors or cameras or other pieces of equipment, and then collect that data and sell it to multiple entities. So you can imagine a city dealing with air quality, but you look at a city like Los Angeles or Sao Paulo, right, where the geographic footprint and the idea of maintaining a consistent network by the city over that geography would be a major capital investment that most cities can't begin with, let alone afford to sustain. But the companies, because they're building out their networks already, are in the position to do so. They could then collect air quality data by deploying air quality sensors strategically around the city. Yes, sell that data to the local city. So they may sell that to Sao Paulo and to their air quality monitoring group. They might also sell it to the local hospitals so that they could understand how to be more proactive in serving patients that they have that are asthmatic or have other lung problems. They may turn around and sell it to manufacturers or construction sites that if they are creating too much pollution, will ultimately get fined. And so it becomes a service to them to help them to monitor where they're at and realize when they have to pull back so that they don't get a fine. This model will allow us to have more sensors across more area, and 5G is going to enable that in some pretty interesting ways.
Yeah, Bill, and just to add to that quickly, 5G
Sure.
with extreme mobile broadband, what we're seeing from an education perspective with universities as well is, the typical student is connecting 2 or 3 devices to university Wi-Fi daily. That has changed significantly in the past 20 years. So we're seeing 5G improvements on university campuses as well. And quite a few people on my team have had conversations about 5G connectivity on the university actual physical geographic campus as students return in person from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Great, thanks, Grace.
Great, thank you.
Mais alguma pergunta, pessoal? Então, como a gente não tem mais perguntas, eu vou encerrar, tá?
I have another one.
Another question.
Sure.
Bill and Grace, how to include the population that lives in rural area like we have in cities in Brazil?
So
it's just a connectivity issue.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a connectivity issue. There's no question. But there is, so, every infrastructure advancement is an economics challenge, right? And that economics challenge is the question of, do we build the infrastructure and then hopefully people leverage the service, or do we build demand for the service and then we build out the capabilities to deliver it? And I think that this is an area that we need to be working with investments that are being made by government and other entities to build out infrastructure, by first getting out in front and starting to build out the demand, the need that's going to be there. So, rural perspective, there are still a number of things that we know smart technologies can assist them with. There's a huge amount of investment in smart technologies as it comes to agriculture, and whether that be um, hydrology sensors that understand, crop water supplies, whether that be data exchanges or marketplaces or other things. And so building the demand for those by educating individuals working on those capabilities, I think can be, one piece of that puzzle. Number two is there's a number of organizations globally, World Bank, UN, Data for Good, and others that have built out some of these types of marketplaces and capabilities already. And so it's not just a matter of the demand being there, but if you have the capacity to bring on the service quickly, that can be quite beneficial. Using that then to consider how do we then demonstrate that demand to the private sector to be able to build that out, can be quite useful. Now, that should be, of course, coupled with any investments that are being made nationally in the expansion of broadband, 5G, or other sources. I don't know the current recovery funding in Brazil particularly well, but in Europe, there's the next gen EU funds that are being used for this purpose. In Japan, they now have a program to build off of the fifth generation industrial revolution or fifth generation society work that they're doing that's being funded for this purpose. And there's others globally. So a combination of supply and demand both need to be done. Too often we focus only on one or the other.
Thank you, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
Mais alguma, pessoal? So I would like to thank Bill, Grace, and Gartner team. And I think our leaders, Professor Camila and Turin, are in that group that accept the risks for new technology, and we are going to improve some smart cities technology here in our university. And Professor Camila wants to talk a little, to speak a little bit.
Thank you. We are here with our leaders. We are in Mato Grosso do Sul state, in the Midwest of Brazil. We live at Pantanal. So we have a long way to work. At our university, it was only this year that we developed a business continuity policy. We have photovoltaic energy, solar energy, air quality monitoring, unique in our state. So we are growing in sustainability and connection. When we did last month research on what would what would be important for sustainability for the community experience. So we need to increase the engagement. So the major engagement and the connection with the local partners. I think this is the most important for us. To define the paths and transform isolated projects into an integrated project with ownership by the community. This will impact the training of young people, our community, and above all, the way in which governments understand cities in Brazil. In this sense, this moment was very important for our path towards institutional growth. So many thanks to Grace and Bill and Gartner for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Bill, you are finishing. Thank you so much. Grace, thank you also. I think that it was a good conversation, and we are available to schedule some specific calls, and Bill send the material for us, okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. Stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye. Thank you.